The silence that awakens inner power. You don't need to shout to be heard. There is a kind of strength that does not impose itself, that does not show itself, that does not need to justify itself. A strength that inhabits silence, that emerges when the soul becomes still and the body no longer needs to fight to be seen. It is in this space, between one thought and another, between a sigh and a held-back tear, that true inner power begins to whisper. In the world that constantly shouts, where everyone seems to be competing for attention, there is something profoundly revolutionary in simply remaining at peace. The presence that does not seek applause, does not need to explain its depth. It simply is, and that is enough. When the pain finally falls silent, when it stops crying out for help, what is left is something sacred, a kind of soundless voice, a raw, primitive wisdom that lives in the center of the chest, and that you may never have heard because there has always been too much noise. But when the pain is silent, the soul speaks, and it does not speak in phrases or arguments. She talks about sensations, about shivers, about memories that come back out of nowhere. She talks about intuitions that cannot be explained, but that run through you like a call that is impossible to ignore. It is at that moment that you begin to understand that not all pain needs to be fought. Some just ask to be heard, deeply, silently, lovingly. The paradox is that many confuse silence with weakness. They think that if you don't react, it's because you're losing. They think that if you don't defend yourself, you're nullifying yourself. But the truth is that the strongest of beings is not the one who resists rigidly. It is the one who knows how to give in with wisdom. Like bamboo that bends before the wind, but never breaks. Like water that surrounds stone and effortlessly transforms it. There is a calm force that doesn't need to be noisy to be felt. It imposes itself through serenity, not anger, through depth, not intensity, and this force lives within you. But perhaps you have forgotten it. Perhaps you have learned that the world only listens to those who shout and only respects those who assert themselves. And so you have learned to survive in the noise, to defend yourself with sharp words, to try to control everything with a tired mind and nerves always on alert. But there is a cost to this, an invisible but devastating cost, because when the noise takes over, you disconnect from what matters most, yourself. And that is why this silence, the same silence that so many fear, becomes so necessary. It is not absence, it is return. This video is an invitation, a call to reconnect with your purest presence. A deep dive, not into the chaos of the world, but into the tranquil vastness of your inner world. Here, we are not looking for quick formulas or promises of control. Here, we are looking for what is real, even when it scares you, because what you are about to rediscover is not just a state of calm. It is a way of existing, a way of taking your place in the world without shouting, without begging for validation, without needing to prove anything. Just being, deeply being. Stay with me. Silence will show you what words never could. The invisible mistake that many make. At first glance, reacting seems natural. It seems instinctive. Someone hits you with a word and you retaliate. A situation gets out of control and you rush to try to control it back. But there is something quietly dangerous about this pattern. Every automatic reaction is an involuntary surrender of power. Because when you react without thinking, you are not choosing, you are being led. You are allowing the world to dictate your internal state. And it is in this space between stimulus and response that lies a freedom that many have never known. The freedom of not being dominated, the freedom of not being moved by what is outside. The most common mistake is to confuse reactivity with strength, as if exploding were a proof of courage, or if keeping quiet were synonymous with submission. But true courage is not in raising your voice. It is in not losing your essence in the face of chaos. It is in remaining centered while everything around you tries to tear you away from yourself. And the most dangerous thing is that many times you do not even realize that you are being manipulated. Emotional triggers are disguised as opinions, subtle gestures, and words spoken in a certain tone. A famous study by psychologist John Bargh showed how something as simple as holding a hot or cold cup of coffee can alter our perception of another person. It seems trivial, but it shows how sensitive we are to invisible stimuli. If even the temperature of an object can affect our judgment, imagine the impact of a criticism, a look, an unresolved memory. That's why, instead of reacting, you can learn to pause, not as if you were running away, but as if you were observing. 3 seconds. Just 3 seconds to take a deep breath before responding. That small space is a portal. It doesn't seem big, but it's there that your brain stops being held hostage by the limbic system and invites the prefrontal cortex to take over. It's there that you stop repeating what you've always done and start choosing who you want to be. It's not about suppressing. It's about refining, about allowing silence to enter before responding, not to hide your truth, but to allow it to emerge with clarity, not with wounds. The world wants to hurry, but your spirit needs a pause, because every time you react without awareness, you reinforce an invisible prison, that of living for the sake of others. But when you learn to breathe before responding, you recover something you should never have lost. You recover the power to be whole, even in the face of imbalance. To remain yourself, even when everything around you wants to transform you into something you are not. This is how strength reveals itself, not in fury, but in the silent center that firmly chooses not to let itself be dragged along. When the mind screams, the body feels it. Not all pain is visible. Not all screams are audible. Sometimes the most brutal battlefield is internal and silent. It's that moment when you're smiling on the outside, but inside there's a war going on. Your jaw is tense. Your chest is compressed, your shoulders are heavy, as if they were carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. The body doesn't lie. It feels what the mind tries to hide. Carl Jung called it the shadow, everything you avoid looking at, but that insists on manifesting itself, and through your body, your dreams, your inexplicable reactions. You feel anger, but say everything is fine. You feel fear, but wear a mask of control, until one day your body starts to speak for you, with pain, with anxiety, with fatigue that won't go away. Stoicism offers us a powerful image, that of fire. Marcus Aurelius said that fire transforms everything that is thrown into it. What he meant was that when you develop presence and self-awareness, even chaos becomes fuel. What once brought you down now makes you stronger, not because it no longer hurts, but because you have learned to burn without destroying yourself. To burn without losing yourself. The inner fire, when well directed, does not consume, it illuminates. But how do you do this in a world where the mind is constantly being bombarded, where thoughts come like arrows and emotions react like flames? The first step is to really listen. Listen without fear. A simple, almost invisible but profoundly transformative method is the mind scan. It is not about thinking more, it is about feeling attentively. Close your eyes for a few seconds and ask yourself honestly, where does it hurt right now? What am I trying not to feel? You may notice a tension that has been there for days. You may discover an old emotion that was never allowed to exist. This act of listening to yourself does not solve everything immediately, but it breaks the cycle. The cycle of silencing your truth out of fear. The cycle of feigning balance while sinking within. The mind can be a battlefield, yes, but it can also be a temple if you learn to enter it with presence, not haste. The difference is in how you approach it, as a warrior who fights or as a master who observes. Because sometimes what your mind needs most is not correction, it's understanding. It screams because it has never been heard. And when you finally listen with compassion, your body thanks you with relief. Tension releases, breathing deepens, and chaos transforms into clarity. The invisible consequence of repressing emotions. There is a subtle but profound difference between silencing an emotion and being silent in order to hear it. To repress is to push it away. To silence is to approach it with courage. When you repress what you feel, you do not eliminate it. You just postpone it, and everything that is postponed accumulates. It slowly transforms into something you do not recognize. Sabotaging behaviors, disproportionate reactions, distancing yourself for no clear reason. All of these are often unheard emotions asking for passage. They do not disappear, they disguise themselves, until one day they explode. There is a dangerous illusion in the culture of misunderstood self-control. This idea that being spiritual means always being at peace, always light, always calm. But that is not spirituality. That is emotional anesthesia. True spirituality is radical presence. It is feeling everything and still remaining whole. It is not about eliminating fear, anger, or sadness. It is about making room for them to exist without them dominating. It's about letting your emotions express themselves truthfully, but not violently. Because when you pretend you don't feel them, you're not evolving. You're moving away from yourself. That's when silence becomes liberation. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of listening. There's a place inside you where everything can be said, without censorship, without judgment. And that place can be accessed through writing. Not beautiful, organized writing, but raw writing. A diary where you allow your pen to say what your mouth can't. Where words flow unfiltered, without fear of making mistakes, without needing to make sense. It's there, in that intimate space, that emotions find a way. And when they find a way, they don't need to scream anymore. You don't have to be strong all the time. You have to be truthful. And truth sometimes hurts, but it's a pain that cleanses, that heals, that frees. Emotional silence, when it comes from consciousness, is not repression, it's maturity. It's like a river that learns to flow within itself without destroying its banks. It keeps flowing, but with direction, with presence, with wisdom. The soul doesn't want you to avoid feeling. It wants you to feel with courage. It wants you to stop running from your shadows and start walking alongside them. Because only when you allow yourself to feel deeply do you begin to live truthfully. Philosophical concept behind emotional attachment. Attachment often doesn't sound like a prison. It disguises itself as love, care, and belonging. But behind the apparent sweetness, there are invisible chains tightening the soul. When you cling to the idea of how things should be, you move away from how they really are. When you cling to a person to fill the void, you turn the other into a mirror of your own absence. Epictetus said, "Wanting things to happen as you want is the beginning of suffering." And he wasn't being pessimistic. He was being lucid, because wanting absolute control over your life is warring against that which was never under your control. Attachment doesn't shout, it whispers. It hides in the details of the day, in the subtle jealousies, in the anxiety for an answer, in the frustration with the unexpected. It is present whenever your peace depends on something outside of you, when your mood fluctuates according to someone's attitude, when your self-esteem plummets due to an absence. It's a sign that you've exiled yourself from yourself. You've surrendered to the instability of a world that never stops. When the soul loses its center, it begins to spin around everything that isn't it. And in this spinning, it gets tired, it gets confused, it breaks. The Stoics, who understood the dance between reason and emotion like few others, practiced daily the memory of impermanence. Premeditatio malorum, the exercise of imagining, with serenity, everything that can be lost, not to cultivate fear, but to strengthen the spirit. Because those who contemplate loss with courage learn to value without attachment. They learn to love without possessing. They learn to live together without forgetting themselves. Detachment, contrary to what people think, is not coldness. It is freedom. It is loving the other with presence, but not with dependence. It is wanting the best without demanding that everything remain the same. The heart that learns to let go does not become insensitive. It becomes wise. It feels more lightly. It suffers with more dignity. It lives more truthfully. Attachment is a comfortable prison, but it is still a prison, and no soul was born to live chained to that which can disappear. You came to be whole, even when everything changes, even when everything leaves, even when nothing comes back, because true security is not in what you hold on to, but in what you let go of, and yet it remains. When you stop seeking approval, something awakens. Hidden truths about spiritual loneliness. There is a silence that comes when you stop trying to be accepted. It doesn't come from outside. It springs from within, like a warm breeze after years of storm. The search for approval is an invisible hunger, and the more you feed it, the more it grows. You try to please, you try to correspond, you try to mold yourself, and in this effort, little by little, you distance yourself from your own essence. The pain of loneliness often comes not from the absence of people, but from the absence of yourself among them. And when you finally stop, when you give up trying to convince the world that you deserve love, something changes, because that's when the reunion begins. Spiritual loneliness is a portal. It scares because it tears off the masks. It hurts because it hands you over to an unadorned mirror. But it's only in this emptiness that the soul finds space to breathe. It's only in this silence that the inner voice, previously muffled, begins to whisper again. It doesn't scream. She waits. She waits for you to get tired of begging for love. She waits for you to realize that it was never about being enough for others, but about recognizing that you were already enough, even when no one saw it. There was a woman. On the outside, she smiled. On the inside, she bled in silence. Whenever she tried to show herself, she felt like she was too much. Whenever she hid, she felt like she was too little. She was an absence trying to fit into places too tight for the soul she carried. Until one day, in the midst of exhaustion, she fell silent. Not because she gave up, but finally, because she woke up. In the silence, she discovered that she no longer needed to prove anything. She discovered that what she was looking for in everyone was already in her. Looking into each other's eyes and saying what you always wanted to hear is an act of sacred reconnection. It's not about convincing yourself of something. It's about remembering. The child you were still waits to hear. You are loved, even when you make mistakes. You are important even when you are not noticed. You are whole even when you feel fragmented. Tell yourself this, even if your voice is shaking, even if your eyes are teary. Say it until your heart, tired of losing itself, starts to believe it. Because when you stop seeking approval, you start to remember who you are. And that remembering is freedom, the art of letting go without losing your essence. The hidden error in the search for peace. Many people confuse peace with escape. They imagine that being at peace means no longer feeling pain, no longer being bothered, living in a bubble that is proof against disappointment. But this is an illusion. Real peace is not the absence of noise. It is a firm presence in the midst of it. It is the art of letting go without breaking inside. The real error is in seeking peace as an anesthetic, because those who seek peace only to protect themselves from the world do not find peace, they find isolation. And isolation does not heal, it postpones. There is an ancient wisdom that says, bamboo bends with the wind, but does not break. It is flexible, silent, invincible. It does not resist the storm by trying to impose force. It adapts. It lets go. It allows nature to follow its course without losing its own integrity. This is what letting go is. It is not abandoning. It is not forgetting. It is not giving up. It is accepting that there are things that cannot be controlled, and there are pains that do not need to be overcome, only understood. There is a practice that may seem small, but has profound power, imagining that which you most fear losing, and allowing yourself even for a moment to let go of it, not to conform, but to free yourself, because when you hold on to something too tightly, you don't realize it, but it is you who is being held by it. And sometimes what we call love is just attachment disguised as care. What we call fidelity is just fear of being alone. And what we call strength is just the inability to accept impermanence. Letting go does not mean losing. It means trusting. Trusting that your essence does not depend on what stays or what goes. Trusting that what is true remains in another form. trusting that what needs to go takes with it only what was no longer you. The art of letting go is a silent ritual, an internal goodbye, without shouting, without explanations. It is the moment when the heart learns that being whole never depended on keeping everything close, but on not losing oneself while everything changes. Because in the end, the only peace that remains is the one that does not require control, just presence. When silence heals more than 1,000 words. Why silence can heal. Silence has a sound. It is not the sound of absence. It is the sound of the purest presence. When the noise of the world ceases, when thoughts become quiet, when inner voices stop screaming, something begins to emerge from a deeper place. It is there, in that space between the last thought and the next emotion, that healing resides. Because what hurts is not always the pain. It is the insistence on not listening to it. And silence heals because it listens to what the mind is afraid to hear. There are pains that cannot be explained. There are wounds that cannot be mended with advice. And there are parts of us that only breathe again when they find silence around them. Silence not as the absence of sound, but as the quality of presence. The kind of silence that welcomes, that understands, that does not demand, that simply is. When we allow ourselves to stop, breathe, be silent, something begins to reorganize itself inside. Emotions return to their rightful place. The body releases tensions that had been accumulating for years. And the soul, for the first time in a long time, feels at home. Thich Nhat Hanh said that silence is more powerful than prayer, because silence does not ask, it surrenders. It surrenders to the now without resistance. And in this silent now, God whispers, intuition blossoms, forgotten wisdom awakens, and the heart, which had been searching for answers in words, realizes that it already knew. It just needed enough silence to remember. Neuroscience confirms it. Silence reduces the activity of the amygdala, calms the limbic system, and strengthens the prefrontal cortex. In other words, silence gives us back control, self-control, clarity, lucidity, a simple cycle of conscious breathing. 4 seconds inhaling, 4 seconds holding, 4 seconds exhaling can interrupt a destructive pattern and make room for a more integral response. It doesn't seem like much until you feel the effect. Because sometimes what saves is not what you do, it's what you stop doing. It's what you allow to dissolve into silence. There is an ancient wisdom in the act of silence, not as repression, but as listening. Because when we speak, we repeat. But when we are silent, we hear what was never said. Silence heals because it touches what is beyond the mind. It doesn't need to convince, it just needs to be. And when you learn to stay with it, you begin to remember who you are, beyond everything you've been told you need to be. Daily training for the unshakable mind. You're not born strong, you train. Inner strength is not a gift, it's a practice. It's the art of becoming whole in the midst of chaos. No one wakes up unshakable. They wake up fragmented, confused, and overly sensitive to what comes from outside. But it's in this raw, still vulnerable state that the opportunity for training arises. A silent, invisible, solitary training. A training that happens inside, in the part that no one sees. While the world demands reactions, you begin to cultivate responses. While the pain pulls you, you learn not to give in immediately. While the triggers scream, you breathe. And in that pause, strength is born. Neuroscience shows that the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for self-control, judgment, and decision-making, is strengthened by the repetition of small conscious acts. A breath before speaking, a silence before judging, a retreat before reacting. These are micro-choices that reshape the brain. These are almost imperceptible gestures, but when added together, they build a mind that no longer bends to the winds of the world. The Stoics knew this long before laboratories. They created methods, daily practices, small rituals that trained the spirit to endure life without losing its integrity. Among these practices, one remains alive to this day, the 3-step process to restore balance. First, recognize the impulse. Honestly perceive what is being activated within you. Then observe the emotion as you would observe a stranger, with curiosity, without judgment. And finally, choose the response that represents who you want to be and not who you were trained to be. This triad, if practiced consistently, rebuilds your presence in the world. But there is no training without discipline, and there is no discipline that resists excess. That is why the path is minimalist. 3 practices, only 3, but done every day. First, intentional silence. 5 minutes without distraction, without stimuli, just you and your breathing. Second, radical gratitude, not for what is good, but for what is real, even when it hurts. Third, active presence. Choosing a moment of the day and inhabiting it completely, with your body, with your senses, with your soul. These 3 seeds, watered daily, transform the soil of the mind. You don't have to be unshakable now, but you need to start, because each time you come back to yourself, a piece of your mind learns to remain whole, even when everything around you tries to tear you apart. And this silent, constant, almost imperceptible learning is what will one day be recognized as strength. But you will know it wasn't magic, it was practice. And it was in the silence that it began. When you become silent inside, the world begins to listen. There comes a time when the search ceases, not because you have found everything, but because you realize that what you were looking for had been whispering inside you all along. But it was a whisper, and the noise from outside was always louder, the noise of expectations, the noise of comparisons, the noise of judgments, of demands, of voices inherited from a history that was not always yours. When silence sets in, these voices dissolve, and then something emerges that never screamed, but was always there, your essence. The absence of emotional noise is not coldness, it is clarity. When you stop reacting to what hurts, you begin to listen to what really matters. The true self, the one that does not depend on approval, control, or victory. A self that is presence, not performance. A self that does not need to prove anything, because it is already whole. It is in this state of wholeness that the world begins to hear you, because there is no longer any noise between what you feel and what you transmit. You become transparent. You become true. Being unshakable was never about hardening. It was about not losing yourself. It was about staying with yourself, even when everything invites you to disconnect. It was about walking with pain without becoming the pain, loving without dissolving, losing without breaking, being silent without disappearing, standing firm, not like a stone, but like a mountain, because the mountain feels the wind but is not moved by it. It listens to it, respects it, but remains. And perhaps this is the final key. Firmness is not rigidity. It is depth. It is root. It is the kind of strength that does not need defense, because it is already at peace with its own vulnerability. A silent strength, unmistakable, unbreakable. And if you have come this far, perhaps you have already felt it. This silence is not absence. It is revelation. It does not take you away from the world. It returns you to yourself. And in this silent return, something awakens. Something that no noise in the world will ever be able to silence. The journey begins in silence. And it is in silence that it reveals who you have always been.